Hello there, and thanks for tuning in to our video on American Hegelianism and support for the Indian boarding schools. My name is Dave Biesecker, and my colleague here to my left, your right.
Hello,
Where's
I'm
Joe?
Joe Irvin. Hello.
Joe is floating around in the air there. We're both from the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. Now, our presentation is actually motivated in part by current events. In the June of last year, Secretary of Interior Deb Haaland launched an investigation into the legacy of federally run and funded Indian boarding schools. Her memo begins, the recent discovery of 215 unmarked graves at Canada's Kamloops Indian Residential School should prompt us to reflect on past federal policies to culturally assimilate Indigenous peoples in the United States. Now, in addition to documenting the legacy of abuse, neglect, and dominance of Indigenous peoples, the reflection that our Secretary of Interior talks about, we think, should also include the justifications that were used to promote the government policy of compelling Indigenous children to leave family tribe customs and even language behind to be acculturated in remote boarding schools far from home or reservation. And it might come as a surprise to at least a few scholars, the extent to which Hegelian thought actually featured in the support and promotion of such policies. In our paper, we propose to tell at least a part of this story by focusing on the leading American Hegelian of the time. That would be William Torrey Harris, who is pictured on this slide, who, as director of the famed Concord School of Philosophy and also the longtime US Commissioner of Education, was highly influential in both philosophical and educational circles. Now, we start our paper with a section giving you a little bit of the history of the Indian boarding schools. And these schools began largely under Richard Henry Pratt and the founding of the Carlisle School in 1879. In his plea to develop the Carlisle School, Pratt wrote to Secretary of Interior at the time, Carl Schulz. He says, it would have been impossible for you to accomplish your elevation if, when you came to this country, Schulz was a German immigrant and an 1848er from Germany. If, when you came to this country, you had been reservated to any one of the solid German communities we have permitted to grow up in some sections of America. Now, in the wake of perceived successes of Indian boarding education at Carlisle and a couple of other examples in Oregon and Kansas, that led the Department of Interior to seek a dramatic expansion of compulsory off-reservation boarding education of indigenous peoples. Education, therefore, was to become the solution to the vexed Indian problem. And this is where Hegelianism enters into the picture in the form of William Torrey Harris. So we also have a section in our paper, we encourage you to read it, of course, focusing on Harris and the St. Louis Hegelians, of which he was one of the founding members. So the St. Louis Hegelians were intellectuals situated in St. Louis. They were originally inspired and led by Henry Conrad Brockmeyer, another German emigre, with an interest in German idealism in general and Hegelianism in particular. Now, we contend that their unfortunate obscurity today is largely due to the fact that they were predominantly educators working outside existing institutions of higher education. Many of them, in fact, as you will see in a moment, were working for the public schools of St. Louis, including Harris. Their mission, as they saw it, was to adapt Hegel to the American situation. As one of them mentioned in a book, Denton Snyder says their mission was to work out what they saw to be undeveloped elements in Hegel. They took their mission to be to make Hegel speak English. And in that light, they established the first American philosophy journal, the Journal of Speculative Philosophy, which by some accounts is also the first professional philosophy journal written in the English language. A little bit more about the St. Louis Hegelians. They took their interpretation of Hegel to be largely informed by their experience in the gateway to the American West, St. Louis, during the time of the American Civil War, and in particular by their proximity to the chaos and violence that erupted surrounding the admission to Kansas to the Union, so-called Bleeding Kansas, which they likened to Hegel's portrayal of the Reign of Terror. Thus, they were reacting against the revolutionary abolition of John Brown, depicted above in this famous Curry painting, and the revolutionary politics embraced by refugees of the 1848 revolutions from Germany and adopted then by the Republican Party, a different Republican Party than the one that we know today. They were equally suspicious of the brittle individualism of New England transcendentalism. In fact, they were known for their feisty exchanges with, for instance, Bronson Alcott and Emerson. And they took the New England transcendentalists only to valorize and encourage folk like the likes of John Brown. As center Hegelians, their closest European ally was William Rosencrantz, the occupier of Kant's chair of philosophy at Königsberg, and also a famed philosopher of education in his own right, who is an auxiliary member of the St. Louis Philosophical Society. Fichte was an auxiliary member as well. Thus, the St. Louis Hegelians advocated for progressive social reform from within existing institutions, and in particular within existing educational institutions. So we have a slide here. I don't want to dwell on this at length, but it details many of the members of the St. Louis movement, including two females, Susan Blow and Anna Brackett, who were a prominent and notable women philosophers at the time when such a thing was virtually unheard of. We also have Denton Snyder, whom I mentioned before, who formed a university college for adult learners in St. Louis. He also served for a term at Jane Addams' Hull House. We have, in addition, Thomas Davidson here. Not only did he found the famous Glenmore School, which featured both William Torrey Harris and John Dewey, who lived right next door during the summers. But he was also, though he opposed Jane Addams' Hull House originally, he comes around to form with Joseph Pulitzer the Breadwinners College in New York City. I mentioned a couple others, but in particular, here's on the bottom left-hand corner pictured is Henry Conrad Brockmeyer. He was a lawyer, politician, and a primary framer of the post-war Missouri Constitution. For the purposes of this paper, it is significant that after his political career, he went down to Muskogee, Oklahoma, and promoted education for the Creek Indians, and is also said to have formed a philosophical society down there in Muskogee. But turning back to our major project, that of Indian education, the Department of Interior commissioned the Bureau of Indian Affairs and also the Bureau of Education to come up with a report in support of the Indian boarding school proposal. And so we have the report, which is written primarily by General T.J. Morgan, but it also had an enthusiastic introduction to William Torrey Harris. Now, we include in the bulk of our paper, in the body of our paper, as well as on this slide, some passages from the major report, if only to illustrate or to highlight that the the education envisioned for the indigenous children was not just vocational education. It also included, in particular, and most interestingly, education for citizenship. And so we have Morgan saying, look, compulsory education is justifiable in this case. It's the Indians' only salvation. With it, they will become honorable, useful, happy citizens of a great republic, sharing on equal terms in all its blessings. Okay, so the import of these passages is to underscore the idea that the education involved is not just to mollify the tribes and give them limited economic opportunities. It is to prepare them for full citizenship of the United States and its organizing and its organizing territories out west. The third quote here is one that is overly optimistic. It says that we can accomplish this within just a couple of generations, don't you know? All right, but let's turn now that we know that the aim of the proposal is to prepare indigenous children and indigenous peoples for full citizenship. Let's turn now to Harris's introduction. And here we have a well-known quote by Harris on the top, where he says, "We owe it to ourselves and the enlightened public opinion of the world to save the Indian and not destroy him. We cannot save him in his patriarchal or tribal institution both together. To save him, we must take him up into our form of civilization." Now, those of you who have interests or knowledge of the Indian boarding schools, you can see in this passage a more refined expression of the thought that Pratt had when he perhaps infelicitously says, "In order to save the man, we must kill the Indian." But in addition, and this is, I think, the most important quote for our purposes in our paper, Harris writes, "To work out this thorough system in all its details," recall, we are preparing for education of indigenous children for citizenship. It is found necessary, or at least desirable, to obtain control of these Indian children at an early age, and to seclude them as much as possible from the tribal influence. And for the rest of our paper pretty much focuses on this passage here and works out and tries to offer an explanation of why Harris thought the removal from the tribe was so necessary. Okay, and we're going to claim that Harris's support for the plan of Indian boarding education is due, at least in part, to his Hegelianism. So following Hegel, we claim, Harris viewed education in terms of Bildung, that is, in terms of the acquisition of a second nature, and our emphasis here, in opposition to immediacy or original nature. So the famous passage from the Philosophy of Right, Hegel writes, "Education, that is pedagogic, is the art of making human beings ethical. It considers them as natural beings and shows them how they can be reborn and how their original nature can be transformed into a second spiritual nature so that this spirituality becomes habitual to them." Pretty much in reaction to this passage, we think, Harris writes, this is Harris now in his preface to his translation of Rosenkranz's Pädagogik. He writes, "Since man's true nature is not found in him already realized at birth, but has to be developed by his activity, his true nature is his ideal, which he may actualize by education. Hence the deep significance of this process, that of education. Man must estrange himself from his first or animal nature and assimilate himself to his second or ideal nature by habit." So we take this to be Harris's expression of the thought that Hegel expresses in the Philosophy of Right. But then how does that bear upon the tribal influence? Well, Harris also takes to heart the recommendation found in the philosophy of right to the effect that good citizenship can be incubated only from within the correct social environment. So Hegel writes, to a father seeking the best way to bring up his son, a Pythagorean or some other thinker replied, make him a citizen of a state which has good laws. Now, Harris seems to have regarded, or clearly regarded, the natural tribal environment to be one that is particularly unconducive to productive, that is, American citizenship. And we identify a couple of reasons for why this might be. First of all, Harris views it to be attached too closely to the simplicities of original nature. As a result, it is, to Harris's eyes, alarmingly precarious. Moreover, as a symptom of this, the tribal cultures, at least in Harris's eyes, lacked a culture of literacy. Okay? The written word for Harris is required for cultural transmission, for a culture or a people's to continually rise up, and not become stagnant and tied too close to nature. So we see in Harris, unlike what we see in Hegel, a strange valorization for textbooks. He was a promoter and editor of a series of readers, for instance, as well as a series of pedagogical theses. We see in Harris a peculiar attachment to textbook methods as opposed to oral methods of learning. And in his eyes, they encouraged self-active learning, that is, for him, education by insight, as opposed to authority. It's because a learner could take the textbook and interrogate the textbook as he sees fit without having to passively sit by and listen to a teacher. But also important to literacy, literacy is required for democratic citizenship. So in addition to textbooks, Harris valorizes the newspapers, by means of which the citizen of a democracy, and I quote, lifts himself above the consciousness of his vocation into the life of the world and beholds the spectacle of universal humanity in its eternal process. You can see the Hegelianism dripping off of that passage right there. But the important point is that Harris identifies learning to read, literacy, as crucial for education for democracy. And he doesn't see that happening amongst the tribes. Now, equally important for his support of the Indian boarding schools, it is also our contention that with Harris, we find an emphasis on the role of Hegelian estrangement in education. So this is working in tandem with his not seeing, in particular, literary traditions within the tribes. Equally important in his defense of the Indian boarding schools, we see him seeing the importance of estrangement in education. And so for Harris, alienation and its attendant discomfort simply was necessary for the cultivation of educated citizens fully prepared for our democratic way of life. Hegelian Bildung is supposed to involve elements of alienation and discomfort, precisely because it requires taking up broader perspectives outside one's home or native environment. So, to prepare an individual for productive, democratic civil life, Harris thought that it is necessary and fitting to remove them at least for a time, from their families and place them in schools. As a result, we contend, Harris was apt to overlook the boarding school's negative or deleterious aspects, and to turn a blind eye to the importance of maintaining feelings of comfort and security within the educational environs. That simply wasn't recognized within his overall philosophy of education. We have here in this slide, again, I don't really want to dwell upon it, some quotes by Harris highlighting the role that he thinks estrangement plays in education. So he says, self-estrangement, as here used, is perhaps the most important idea in the philosophy of education. And he says later on in his own book on education, the process of self-estrangement and its removal underlies all education. And a couple of further quotes that talk about Harris's feeling that in order to learn, well, you have to suffer some alienation and discomfort. And we think that this attitude at least underlies or at least provides some support for his blithely overlooking some of the deleterious aspects of the proposal to remove Indian children from their tribes and educate them off reservation. All right, so some concluding remarks. We don't intend to editorialize too much here, but we do note that there is nothing in Harris's educational philosophy, as we just said, that counterbalances the role of estrangement within education. And perhaps again, we don't intend to editorialize here too much, but we do notice that Harris seems to overlook developments within the tribes at the very time at which this proposal is being floated. So it seems that the tribes were not nearly as stuck in time as Harris seems to have supposed or seems to have written. He disregards what we claim to be self-active developments within Indian territory, that is present-day Oklahoma, which he could have seen to be a model for Indian education more generally. So at least within Indian territory, there were developments in literacy, including writing down, including written languages for languages for native tongues. We also see the development of courts and constitutions and Harris's seemingly favored democratic institution, that of the newspaper. And we also see the development of educational institutions such as the Indian Nations University within, at Muskogee by Almond Bacon, that in stark contrast to the Indian boarding schools, didn't seek to erase tribal heritages at all, but rather to bring them to a par or to adapt European institutions to the native context. So we seem to think that Harris disregarded all of this in his support of the Indian boarding schools. And that actually, we find that to be particularly exciting because the other founder of the St. Louis movement, the St. Louis Philosophical Society, that Henry Conrad Brockmeyer, was working within Muskogee precisely at that time. And as an advertisement for a future project of ours, we want to understand exactly what he was doing. We understood that he was promoting Indian education, but it seems like he adopted a vision very different from Harris. So in any event, for both good or for ill, it seems that Hegelianism featured in coming to terms with in the problem of Indian education. By way of conclusion, in the paper, we have the following passage by Alan Wood. Alan Wood writes, but Hegel's conception of Bildung, he's writing on Hegel's conception of education. The Hegel's conception of Bildung takes for granted modern society's conception of a whole series of oppositions, which are now often questioned. Among these are undevelopment cultivation and backwardness progress. Such questioning may arise from a recognition of the way in which the practical applications of these distinctions has led to the brutal destruction of non-European cultures in many parts of the world, whose wisdom, art, and social institutions surely had much to contribute to the education, cultivation, and progress of the human species. And their barbarous suppression in the name of those very values has surely been a serious step backward. This paper, our paper, is meant to provide a concrete example of just the point that Alan Wood is driving at. But further, in the current efforts to assess the legacy of the Indian boarding schools, those efforts that were mentioned in the first couple of slides at the beginning of our paper and this presentation, we hope that the role that American Hegelians played in shaping this policy does not get lost. And with that, Joe and I thank you. We have here on this final slide, here, Joe, do you want to? Yep.
Yeah, thank you.
There he is flickering and floating around in the ether. We have some further work relating, some of our further work relating to the St. Louis Hegelians is detailed below. And we encourage you to take a gander at our paper as well as to some of this further work. And thanks for listening. Bye-bye.